Thank you very much. Now, I will apologise in advance for what is possibly the most immodest title for a cartographic talk ever given, The Unstoppable Advance of OpenStreetMap. And you might think that this is just an example of hubris. That's the Wikipedia definition of hubris, our crowdsourcing friends. They say that hubris is extreme pride or arrogance, overestimation of one's own competence or capabilities. And you could be forgiven for thinking that maybe OpenStreetMap's a bit like that. Maybe you've heard a lot about it over the past few years and you're thinking, well, how does this make any difference to me? When am I going to see actual real maps made with OpenStreetMap data? When am I going to be able to use it myself? How does this actually change anything? And so I don't actually want to get into a sort of how great we are talk today, despite the title. If I were a few thousand miles to the east at the moment, I would be at the OpenStreetMap conference, the State of the Map, which is just getting underway in Tokyo, and I would be doing a great sort of rallying the crowd, rallying the troops talk, saying how great we all are. But this is something different. This is a commission, which I think is absolutely lovely. It makes me think of Lord Leveson and inquiries and all of that sort of thing. So I hope you'll be a bit gentler with me than that. But I'd like to take a fairly down-to-earth and a fairly pragmatic view as to where OpenStreetMap is now and how it fits into a context of neocartography. And obviously to do that, we have to ask, what is neocartography? What is neo? I suspect we'll probably have 4 talks today, all answering that in their own ways. But there is lots of ways of defining neo, and here is one possible way of doing it. And you've read this already. I think we both happened upon the same quote, but this does bear repeating. I think it's a very good quote, that we make our own maps, we show what we want, and we are the intended audience as well. We make the maps for themselves just because they can. And completely by coincidence, I think I've happened upon the same quote of Gary's as well. Practice of making maps outside of the formally accepted cartography profession. And another luminary, Ed Parsons, said something very similar, outside the community of professional map makers. But if I can, I'd like to introduce a 4th luminary to the conversation, to the discussion about what neocartography might be. As far as I know, he's never made a map, but this is neocartography. Anyone can make a map. This is a chap called Ian Brown, who anyone who's as old as me will recognise. He's the lead singer of the Stone Roses, and he famously said, "It's not where you're from, it's where you're at." I don't actually think that neocartography per se excludes traditional map makers. You can be someone who's skilled in ArcGIS, in Illustrator, whatever it is, and you can still do neocartography. It's not just about bright young things playing around with Python and Ruby. So we can possibly slightly reword the definition. Rather than making outside the formally accepted cartography profession, we can say outside the formally accepted confines of cartography, the things that have been defining what holds cartography in the past 10, 20 years. So that requires that we strike some things out, and it also requires that we keep some things about cartography. And essentially cartography of any sort, whether it's old or neo, is all about design. Nothing's going to change that. Cartography is about communication, it's about design. And to a certain extent, I think neocartography is possibly going to be, it's possibly a less disruptive term than neogeography ever was, because cartographers have always been a little bit neo. And because this is a talk about cartography in London, I do, of course, have to mention Frank Beck and the tube map. Back in the 1930s, the concept of having a tube map like that was very neo, it was very revolutionary. In fact, I saw on Twitter yesterday, no cartography meeting is ever complete without a tube map talk. This was referring to the Society of Cartographers. So here you go, here's the tube map reference to today. But neo does mean striking some things out. I think it means striking out these words like authoritative and definitive, the idea that a map has to come from a particular source, that it has to be produced in a particular way. The phrase consistent business workflow, which I've struck out there, was one I took from the comments section on James Fee's blog a couple of weeks ago, where someone was criticising OpenStreetMap. He said, well, how can I ever trust anything that I get from OpenStreetMap? I don't know why people have added the information there in the first place. There's no consistent business workflow. And you know, that's a point. It's a way of looking at things, but at the same time, I guess the guys at Encyclopedia Britannica are probably sitting there asking themselves the same question. Don't get why anyone uses Wikipedia. They've not got a consistent business workflow. Mookie Hackley from this very building came up with an answer which I think puts OpenStreetMap in context and explains why it is doing well. That it's not authoritative, it's not definitive, it's good enough. For the purposes that people want to put it, it does the job. And those two words explain the rise of OpenStreetMap and OpenStreetMap's place within neocartography. And we can explain this with a graph, I think. Now, I'm an arts graduate, so you have to bear in mind that there are no facts behind this graph at all. There are no statistics, and I think I've got the things on the right axes, but if there's any statisticians in here, you can correct me. But this is, very simply, time along the bottom and a measure of quality, completeness, whatever you want to call it, up the y-axis. Now, we start in 2004, and we start at Regent's Park, which is where the first roads in OpenStreetMap were. And at that point, what was OpenStreetMap good enough for? Well, it was good enough for Steve Coast to go to some geek meetings. I think Dorkbot was the thing back then, and say, hey, I've got this great idea. Some of you should join me. And he did that. A few people joined him. By the time we get to 2006, we've reached this level of quality. We are good enough for a map in Wikipedia. One of these geeks who joined in was a chap from Weybridge. He thought, I can go and map my own town. He did. He rendered it with a fairly primitive renderer we were using then. He uploaded it to Wikipedia. That was OpenStreetMap's first outing into the wider world, really. That was the level we got to by 2006. Another couple of years. And you can see we're getting a bit further on. 2008, of course, was the Beijing Olympics. Flickr wanted to show photos on superimposed on a map, the photos that their users had taken at the Olympics. The traditional providers didn't have maps of Beijing. Apparently the authorities there don't really like it that much, but we had somehow managed to get our contributors to map Beijing, and lo and behold, we were good enough for Flickr to use us there. Nestoria as well, a property website who've been great supporters of OpenStreetMap over the years, decided to offer an optional layer where you could see their properties on an OpenStreetMap background. Now, you'll see this word option coming back and forth quite a lot, because OpenStreetMap has not necessarily always been ready for the jump to prime time straight away, but it's been good enough to sort of hide behind the curtains a bit, say, hey, if you want to just click this, you'll get a nice community-made map. And as time goes on, as the map gets better, then it gets pushed to the forefront. And as we see the development of the map over time, you'll actually see that more of this happens. 2010, Bing and MapQuest put us on as options. 2011, we're on maps at railway stations. That's a bit more into the forefront. We're on iPhoto for OS X. And something which I don't think gets enough publicity is that we're actually, as of 2011, the default mapping source for MapQuest in what I've euphemistically called the rest of the world. For places which are MapQuest's core markets, so the States, Britain, that sort of thing, then they're still using bought-in data, I think mostly Navtech. But if you go to South America, if you go to the Philippines, if you go to, again, the rest of the world, then you will actually see the little OpenStreetMap credit in the corner for the core MapQuest view. And then 2012, the year of switch to OSM, all of these companies are starting to use OpenStreetMap a bit more prominently. And again, as you go up here, you're seeing that as the quality gets better, not only we're getting more prominent, but it's getting to a stage where people for whom cartography is more part of their core business are feeling able to adopt us. Foursquare are all about cartography, all about geography, and OpenStreetMap is now good enough for them to use it. Now, you'll see I've projected that going up past 2012 into the next couple of years, and you might ask, is OpenStreetMap going to continue being good enough? Will it still continue to cut the mustard? And I'd like to just break out the presentation for a quick minute to hopefully show a bit of evidence on that one. This is, of course, where you find out that things written by open source guys don't actually work on Internet Explorer. This was released just the other day, and it doesn't work on Internet Explorer. Splendid, okay. There's a little error message at the bottom. If you, after this talk, if you have a browser that isn't Internet Explorer, go and have a look at live.openstreetmap.fr. Wonderful new website just created the other day, which is showing OpenStreetMap live edits, where people are editing now, what people are doing, and the pace of it is astonishing. I just sat down in front of it this morning, and 20 minutes went by as I was sort of transfixed watching what people were changing. The line continues going upwards. The line, I think, is even continuing going upwards even if we do something really stupid like shoot ourselves in the foot with a licence change. That's what we've been doing recently. I do believe in the licence change despite the slide. I think it's a terrific idea. But I mean, really, of all the things that could have stopped OpenStreetMap's development, asking hundreds of thousands of users all to sign up to a new set of terms, otherwise their data would be deleted, is one of them. And actually it's worked out really well. The line's still going up. So unstoppable might seem a bit like hubris, but it's almost turning out to be true. So where are we going to be in the next couple of years? Well, this is from Sean's company ITO. This is an analysis of how complete we are in Britain at the moment. Obviously I've cherry-picked the top ones, but that's quite interesting. In a whole bunch of regions there in Britain, we are 100% complete insofar as one can ever be 100% complete, but that's kind of interesting. And I think what that's showing us is that in 2013, maybe one of the big map makers will decide to put us a bit more prominently there. You know, click here for the community's made map and not hide it away quite so much as they've been doing. 2014, maybe we'll be good enough to actually be the default data provider in a couple of Western European countries. If we are 100% complete and if we're free of charge, why on earth not? And the data is of decent quality. This is the next big thing for OpenStreetMap in 2013, probably is routing. This is the open source routing machine, which is there. Proper draggable, good quality routes, just like Google or any other mapping provider. All good stuff. But I'm slightly getting off the topic there, because if, by definition, I'm judging OpenStreetMap against the commercial mapping providers, against what's already out there, then that's not Neo. So if we head back to a definition of what OpenStreetMap is and how it could be Neocartography, we have this lovely quote from Martin van Exel. OpenStreetMap is warm geography, not the cold geography of thematic geodata churned out with national mapping agencies. Real people mapping what is important to them. Now, he's used these terms, warm geography and cold geography. You could possibly use Neocartography instead of warm geography. Similar concept. And just as a few examples of people mapping what's important to them. This astonished me. I stumbled across it a couple of months ago. This is about 30 miles west of where I live, Vale of Evesham in Worcestershire, and the amount of detail that someone has put in there to mapping all the footpaths, all the tracks, this sort of thing in the area is absolutely phenomenal. The only other place you're going to get that level of detail for that is from an Ordnance Survey Land Ranger map. The big difference here is that the data is actually routable. So if you wanted to get a footpath route from Honeybourne to Bretforton, where there is a very nice pub, so it's a good thing to do, then that's the only place you're actually going to be able to find it. And again, another example of people mapping what they like. This is National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire. As you would expect for an arboretum, they have even mapped the trees. They're the little green dots all around. And whenever anyone talks about mapping what you like for OpenStreetMap, the poster child is always cycling, and in fact it's usually OpenCycleMap done by Andy over there, so I hope he'll forgive me if I'm actually going to choose a different cycle map for the example today. But this is the Swindon cycle map. Now this is interesting because it's done by an established cartographic company, done by Steer Davies Gleave. It's a really, really good map. I've chosen this particular example because I know that it is people mapping what is interesting to them, because Green Meadow Primary School in the middle is where my wife teaches, and so some of the cycle paths around the back of that have been mapped by her and me. So, you know, that's still very much Neo in a lot of ways. I don't see that just because it's done on paper, just because it's done by an existing company, it's any less Neo than Andy's Open Cycle Map, which is also a similar rendering of cycling in Swindon. And we can go a bit beyond that. We can go beyond people just mapping what they want to different ways of looking at the world, and I could churn out 500 examples of stuff that Stamen, the studio in the States, are doing, and you can go and research them yourselves if you like, but this is just one of them. This is in an affectionate dig at OpenStreetMap tagging. This is called map equals yes, and that's absolutely lovely because you know where it is. You can see the Place de l'Étoile, you can see the Arc de Triomphe right in the middle there, even though for some reason it looks like a dog bone when you look at it from above, but it's different ways of looking at the world in a way, and they came up with a lovely quote, which is, what if instead of a Swiss Army knife we used a box of crayons to make maps, or charcoal or newsprint or Play-Doh? What would those maps look like? What could they tell us about the world? Sometimes it's not even about doing something especially radical. Sometimes it's just good design. This is another Stamen map. This is their terrain map. I don't think there's anything cartographically breaking new moulds there. It's just a really, really good map. That is one of the best web maps I've ever seen. The design in that, all the classic things, all the placement, the shields, all of that is done really, really beautifully. And we can go beyond that. This is, you don't get the full effect because I've just taken a still from it, but an artist called Mark McKeague did this really quite clever sound symphony, almost, called it City Symphonies, which was traffic flow visualization around junctions in London, done by modelling around OpenStreetMap data. Now, I don't really want to get too much into this because we're still effectively talking cartography, and I'm probably traditional enough to think that cartography is graphics, it's not sound. But nonetheless, it does show where you can be going, because when you've got the free access to data which OpenStreetMap gives, it starts to enable this sort of thing. It starts to let you look beyond just a simple one-to-one latitude, longitude mapping. It starts to let you look beyond a constant scale. And we start to get back to Harry Beck again, because this is an interesting one. This is the this is Mapumental, done by My Society. It's a heat map of travel time distances from a particular place. I think this is a leisure centre in southeast Oxford, and it's quite a nice way of showing things. The heat map's a very familiar metaphor, but you start to wonder, well, actually, if you put a lot of time into mangling around the data a bit, could you do something even more radical with that? Could you perhaps do something with sort of zone 3, this is stuff within 30 minutes, and do things diagrammatically within that? There's no legal, no programming reason why you couldn't. So, how does OpenStreetMap enable neocartography? Essentially, I think this is the equation. Any map is the cartographer, the data, and the tools. And we give you the second and third parts of that. We give you the data, you don't have to pay for it. We give you the tools, you don't have to pay for them either. So, all you need to do is bring the design, bring your ideas, and the maps come out of the end of it. Or at least that's the idea. So in a way, it's democratizing cartography, because previously you would have had to pay for the data, you'd have had to pay for the tools, and the data, not always, but the data in a lot of cases was effectively around the needs of motorists. Whereas we've got much richer data, we've got free data, and we've got free tools. Can we be a bit more hubristic in what we call it? Can we say it's a cartographic revolution? Well, no, maybe not, because I've been showing you slides of things like cycle maps and walking maps, and there's nothing new about that. People have always been making walking maps and cycling maps, so that's not revolutionary at all. But if we look at it in a very, I don't know, am I allowed to say in a Marxist sense? Then a revolution in political sense, that's a better way of looking at it. A revolution is about breaking the structures of power. It's about giving power back to the people, and that's really what we're doing with neocartography. What we're trying to do is remove these notions of authoritative and definitive, and say anyone can make a map. So I'd like to finish off briefly by showing you this fine fellow, who's a chap called Anthony Bourdain. He's a celebrity chef. He writes very well. Even if you're not particularly into cooking, you should read him. He's good fun. And he wrote this book a few years ago called The Nasty Bits, which is in theory, all about the underside of cooking, which is what he tries to write about. But there's a quote in it which is, he talks about hearing a casual remark by my French sous chef as he watched a busboy repairing a piece of kitchen equipment with a teaspoon. "Ah, le système D," he said with a smirk and a warm expression of recognition. For a moment, I thought I'd stumbled across a secret society, a coven of warlocks, a subculture within our subculture of chefs and cooks and restaurant lifers. I said, "Did you say System D? What on earth is System D?" The sous chef replies, "Tu connais, you know, MacGyver?" I nodded, flashing onto the idiotic detective series of years back, where the hero would regularly bust out of maximum security prisons and perform emergency neurosurgery using nothing more than a paperclip and a chewing gum wrapper. "MacGyver," pronounced my sous chef. Ça c'est System D." That's also neocartography, I think. We're not quite using a paperclip, we're using the collected survey work of a bunch of amateurs. We're not quite using a chewing gum wrapper, we're using some freely downloadable tools. And even though I'm not a great fan of it, I think it might be a bit harsh to describe ArcGIS as a maximum security prison. But whether you're a long-standing cartographer or a newcomer to it, neocartography and the free data enables you to build any map you want. That's it, thank you very much. System D is unsurprisingly my website, that's what I do, and that's OpenStreetMap at the bottom. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. Any questions for Richard?
Richard, about the point about the revolution, I would argue that just like the French Revolution, it's one group of bourgeois taking the another group of bourgeois. So the reason actually the revolution here is just breaking one power structure in order for someone else, i.e. geeks, taking power and controlling the business. What would you say for that?
I'd actually go back to this slide, which I think is interesting. I mean, yeah, to a certain extent that's right, and I can't completely disagree with that. But it's interesting if you look at the areas where we've got 100% coverage, not all of them are middle-class geeky areas. Certainly if you've ever been out in Great Yarmouth on a Saturday night, then it's not necessarily the nicest place in the world. We're starting with, up there you've got Wrexham, you've got Ellesmere Port at the bottom. Now, I sort of was slightly surprised. I expect to see Oxford and Cambridge up there as the 100% complete areas. In actual fact, it's a bit more than that. Again, number 8, Pembrokeshire, this very rural, spread out area. Okay, it's not poor, but that's traditionally the sort of place where we should be struggling with coverage. So, yeah, I'd agree to some extent, but I think you can possibly overstate that.
I need to run again my index of multiple deprivation, but the trend in the past was that you're not doing well in the index of deprivation. Actually, you have a reverse correlation. The more you go down the deprivation index, the less you are covering. And actually, in all these rural areas, you have a lot of activities of people that are not from the area covering it. So it would be really interesting to do the analysis and see exactly what's going on there.
Yeah.
There is an issue, for example, with the community that is not welcoming or resisting even the general public.
It's a challenge. I also wonder, looking at some of those, whether we have the slightly we have the introduced aspect of sources like Ordnance Survey Open Data. So it is possible that in Wrexham, we've got a couple of guys from Wrexham who are wandering around and mapping their hometown, even though it's not the richest place in the world. It's also possible that you've got one guy who's just copied it from Ordnance Survey. So, yeah, it's possible. But one of the things that the community is certainly aware of is that we can't sit on our laurels as far as contributing is concerned. It has to become simpler and it has to become easier. So, at the moment, there's something of a learning curve and there's something of a geek mentality required to contribute. That is a known problem, and I'm sure it will be addressed, as to a certain extent it has been over the past 5 years. Andy?
I hadn't seen that live, the OpenStreetMap.fr thing before. I think it's great. I've been running it on the laptop here. It's 14 minutes since you mentioned it. There's been 121 different people who have contributed 46,146 different changes. just in that 14-minute.
That's terrific, yeah.
And the only continent you haven't had any edits on has been Australia. Yeah, they're asleep, but in Japan, Taiwan, and China, there's been edits since you mentioned.
Yeah.
I find it phenomenal.
It's fantastic, and it really is. I say you can just stare at it for hours and see what people are doing. I was looking at it earlier and thinking, I never knew that we had this much data in so many places. It was a bit like that moment looking at the Vale of Evesham, seeing all the footpaths, but a new one of those every 3 seconds.